Joe Biden will speak with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over the phone. This comes 3 days after Israel launched an attack in which 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers were killed in Gaza. The aid workers were killed when their convoy was hit shortly after they were overseeing the unloading of 100 tons of food brought to Gaza by sea. World leaders have reacted strongly, including the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. The White House has described Biden as outraged and heartbroken by the attack. However, the President has made no fundamental change in the United States' steadfast support for Israel in its conflict in Gaza.
And so we are going to continue to mourn with them, with Chef Jose Andres and obviously the families. I'm just not going to, he's going to speak for himself. We are very clear about where we stand. I think the President's statement was incredibly powerful, impactful, and really truly lays out how he feels about the current situation.
Meanwhile, as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continues to face pressure at home and abroad over the war in Gaza, Israel's War Cabinet member Benny Gantz has now called for national elections in September. Gantz said he believed an agreed election date would allow Israeli society to renew its contract with its leadership. Thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets in recent days demanding new elections. Many have criticised Netanyahu and expressed anger at his government's handling of the 134 Israeli hostages still held in Gaza 6 months into the war. Well, we're now joined by our correspondent Jody Cohen from Tel Aviv. And Jody, President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu are expected to speak on the phone on Thursday. What do you think is likely to be the conversation?
Hi, Oliver. So this call comes after President Biden expressed outrage about the deaths of the aid workers. The IDF called it an unintentional grave mistake, but Defense Secretary Austin said that the tragedy reinforces US concern about the potential Israeli ground operation in Rafah. So they're likely to be discussing the investigation of this incident and the Rafah plans. It's also likely that Netanyahu will thank President Biden for his continued support throughout this war, including improving the sale of military equipment to Israel this week, despite their differences in policy. Now, it's thought that Biden and Netanyahu agree that Israel needs to defeat the last Hamas battalions in Rafah, but disagree on how to do that without harming civilians. Israel believes that the most effective way is to evacuate civilians to central Gaza, where shelter and aid would be provided, and that this military pressure on Hamas is also the best way to bring Hamas to a deal to release the 134 Israeli hostages who are being held captive in Gaza. Now, the US reportedly wants civilians to remain in Rafah and for Israel to carry out raids against Hamas like in the West Bank. And an Israeli delegation is expected to head to Washington next week for further talks on this.
Well, let's turn to the situation in Israel. Of course, the War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz, we've heard what he's had to say, and he was, of course, seen as a chief rival to Netanyahu before he joined the coalition after the October attack. But now he's called for an election in September. Do you think that's likely to happen?
It's hard to say. I mean, when Gantz called for the election in September, he cited the need to maintain unity and also to renew trust in the government. Head of the opposition, Yair Lapid, and the anti-government protesters as well, they're saying that September is not soon enough, that they want elections now. But September is well before the current coalition's term ends. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has suggested that it's not the time to be engaged in politics and disunity. He said that the government would remain until the war goals have been achieved. And he said that an election would lead to paralysis in the war and the hostage negotiations. Now, some friends and family of the hostage who I've spoken to, they disagree, but some agree and say that it's not the time for elections now, and they've actually called on protesters, for example, not to use the posters of their children in their protests. That's because they believe that combining anti-government protests with rallies for the hostages would embolden Hamas in the hostage release talks. So right now it's not thought that an election is likely, but September is still a long way away.